introduce Dan Sheldon today. He's an assistant professor at UMass with a joint appointment with Mount Holyoke College. Before he joined the UMass, he spent 2 years doing as an NSF postdoc fellow working with Tom Dietrich at Ohio State University.
Oregon State.
Oh, sorry. Oregon State.
The other OSU.
Oregon State University. Before then, he did a PhD at Cornell. That's also where I got mine. And while I was fussing with natural language data, Dan was fussing with bird data. And if you think about it, it's a little bit unusual to think about computational problems in nature, because AI typically focus on more human-centric problems like natural language or computer vision or robotics that does something for us. But nature is also a very important part of our life, and I was surprised that you can actually look at computational problems in like bird science citizens data that observes bird. And what I really like about Dan's work is that the data is extremely hard to deal with. So when I was at Cornell, I had other friends also spending some time on this data, and usually they have a dark period. Whereas Dan did fascinating work with that hard data. So today, Dan is going to talk about some of his recent work in this space. Oh, I should also mention that he got Best Paper Award in Computational Sustainability area in AAAI in 2013, and I'm excited to see what's up with research.
All right, thanks for the introduction. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about the work I've been doing since grad school on big data and algorithms for ecology and conservation. Okay, so let me sort of give you the big picture of the intro. So, I've been working on problems in environmental science and specifically in ecology and conservation. So let's think about ecological processes. So ecological processes occur at really huge scales, right? So these are things like food webs, mass movements of animals such as birds, and invasions of invasive species. And these have traditionally been things that are very, very hard for scientists to study, right? Because if we think about what an individual scientist can do for a process that takes place on the scale of continents or planets, they can observe only a very sort of limited view of what's actually going on these really large-scale processes. But the story in environmental science is much like the story in many other academic disciplines, that it is undergoing sort of a data revolution. So what does that mean? We're now able to collect all sorts of broad-scale observational data about ecological processes. This includes things like citizen science observations of where animals are. We're able to track animals and see where they're going. We're able to put sensors out in the environment to record not only animals, but also the environmental conditions that they're experiencing. And we're also able to remotely collect data about the environment and also build very detailed maps of landscapes. So this is sort of the fabric on which these processes occur. Okay, so we have all these new sources of data. Let me zoom in on two sort of particular ones that I've been working on over the last few years. Okay, so one data set that I got involved in, and I think this is probably the one that Eugene alluded to, was this eBird data set. So what is eBird? eBird is this sort of massive, hugely successful citizen science project started by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology many years ago. And the idea behind eBird is that people, citizen scientists, go out bird watching, and they keep lists of what they see, and they report those lists back to the eBird database. Very simple idea, but there's a lot of highly motivated people who do this, and they're able to collect a lot of data this way. And so what's exciting about this is, although no individual scientist or their lab can actually go and see bird migration happening at broad scales, if you just collect data from a lot of individuals and piece it together with very simple movements, you see these really striking patterns. So what I'm going to show you right now is a movie that I made in 2007. And this was one of the first times that people were actually able to see things like bird migration happening in front of their eyes. So what's going on in this movie is that we're looking at a loop of the entire year, and we're seeing a whole bunch of eBird checklists sort of lighting up on the map when they occur. And all this sort of background yellow dots, those are places and times when people submitted an eBird checklist that did not include this bird up in the top right corner, the ruby-throated hummingbird. And all of the blue dots are those checklists where the people did observe the ruby-throated hummingbird. And sort of what you're seeing is that you're seeing here is the spring. They're sort of migrating from Central America up into the eastern US for breeding. And then in the fall, they sort of disappear back into Central America. All right? So by piecing together all of these observations, we see this sort of really striking pattern. Okay. Here's another example. So what this is showing a loop of a weather radar image from Dover, Delaware. Okay. And you could see this. You could go on to, this is the same weather radar imagery that you would see if you went into Weather Underground or your favorite weather website. And what each one of these big sort of expanding donut patterns is actually a very large flock of birds, probably tree swallows. And what they're doing is they're taking off from very large communal roosts. There might be hundreds of thousands or up to 1 million birds in the sort of largest one of these roosts. They're flying up into the air and they're sort of spreading outwards to forage. Okay? So this is another source of sort of broad scale information about an ecological process. Okay, so why is this significant that we're able to now sort of collect all of this data? I think I alluded to this. This data provides us this sort of wide-angle lens for these processes that occur at very large scales. So if we think about something like bird migration or even climate processes, these are things that occur at huge scales. To study them, we need to build sort of observational networks to gather data about them. Okay, so the question is, we have these new data sources in ecology in particular. What can we do with them right now? And the answer is, we feel very strongly that these provide a lot of scientific information that we haven't had accessible before. And we're making progress in terms of using them to understand the processes themselves. But I'll argue that we're actually fairly far from the goal of ultimately what we want to do with this data. And ultimately, what we want to do with this data is really have a very rich pipeline where we can collect observations, use those observations we want to interpret the noisy and incomplete data to extract biological knowledge. We want to use that data to actually fit process-based models of things like bird migration. We want to be able to use those models to formally test scientific hypotheses, like think statistical hypothesis tests about the mechanisms behind bird migration. And then we want to use those models to actually make decisions about things like conservation. How do we conserve ecosystems? So this is sort of a vision, right? We have this really noisy data coming into this pipeline, and this is what we would love to be able to do. And we want to do all these things at very large scales. And I guess the fundamental argument that I'll make is that there's a lot of things that we don't know how to do here. The data is becoming available, but there's a lot of problems that we don't know how to solve. And I'll argue that fundamentally, a lot of these problems are actually algorithmic. So we can take data, we can write down statistical, very well-defined statistical problems, and when fusing many different sources of noisy observational data to reason about a very large process, you quickly run into sort of algorithmic problems. And so this has been what's driving a lot of my research. And I just want to sort of make this argument that there's actually, I think 2 reasons we should do this. One, I think that these are important societal problems that we as computer scientists should be looking into if we want to sort of do the right research going on into the future. And I think the other is that these are really fun problems for us as computer scientists to work on. So I hope I'll sort of illustrate that today. By the way, you should jump in and ask questions as I move on through the rest of the talk. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is, I've sort of broken this up into sort of 3 categories of problems. One is interpreting noisy data to extract biological information. The other is using that data to fit models of ecological processes. And the third is using data and models to actually make decisions. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about 2 sort of broad frameworks that fit into these 2 categories of fitting models and designing policies or making decisions. And let me jump right in with the first one, which is collective graphical models. Okay, so what are collective graphical models? Collective graphical models are a framework for inference and learning with aggregate data. And they were motivated by this problem that I sort of showed first, learning about bird migration. Okay, so here's the motivation. So if we take that eBird data that I showed you, we can do lots of nice things with it. One of the really nice things that we can do with it is we can create these beautiful maps of the spatial distribution of different species over time, right? And so one way to think of what eBird actually provides to us, it provides us enough information to estimate these distributions at different times of the year pretty accurately. But let's think about now, what do we actually want to do as scientists learning about migration? Fundamentally, what we really want to do is be able to fit models of migration. You know, so underlying all of these maps, there's a lot of birds flying around. And we want to understand those models for how and why those birds fly around. So we want to do things like learn about what actual migration routes are heavily followed by birds. We want to know under certain weather, you know, under what weather conditions will birds decide to actually fly versus not fly. We want to know if the average surface temperature of the Earth increases by 1 degree, how will that affect the timing and routes of bird migration, right? So this is what we want, but fundamentally, unfortunately, these are sort of questions about what individual birds are doing, and eBird is not tracking individual birds, okay? So how can we bridge this gap? Okay. So in order to introduce collective graphical models, I want to start with a little thought experiment. So, you know, the first thing that we often do is we write down a model, and then we use the data that we have to fit a model. So for our thought experiment, let's first imagine what would we do if we actually had the data that we wanted. And I'll argue that in this case, the data that we would like to have would be actual tracks of individual birds, okay? So suppose we could imagine taking the United States, let's divide it up into, let's just agree to work in discrete space and time, so let's divide it up into grid cells. And let's suppose that for some large number of birds, n, I'm able to actually follow the exact trajectory of grid cells that bird is in, each bird is in, for, let's say, every day or every week, okay? So if I handed you this data and I asked you to fit a model, I think one of the first things that a lot of people would turn to is some sort of model, some sort of Markovian transition model for how birds are behaving, okay? And so that's what I've illustrated here. I have random variables x1 through xt. This is, I'm illustrating a Markov chain here, meaning that the distribution over these trajectories is defined by these probabilistic transition functions that say at a given time step, what is the distribution over next possible locations for each bird, okay? And also, notice that I'm drawing this Markov chain as being parameterized by some parameter theta. So I'm not just thinking about this Markov chain where there's a transition matrix and I always make transitions according to one single transition matrix. I have, you know, some set of parameters theta that can control these transitions in a biologically meaningful way. So the decision to transition could depend on things like how far are the grid cells away. It could depend on, is the wind favorable for a trip between grid cells C and N, and so forth, okay? So this is an entirely, yes?
I'm just trying to understand the mapping between the grid cells on the left and this Markov chain. I mean, is the Markov chain in reality a two-dimensional?
So the Markov chain, so each, yes, so the xt is a random variable. The value of the random variable is one of these grid cells. So that's the location of the bird at time t. And then during xt plus 1 will be another random variable that depends only on the value of xt and not the previous ones.
So for the connectivity, the graphical connectivity.
Yeah, they could fly to anywhere in this map.
But on the graphical model at the bottom, that's time, so it's one-dimensional.
Okay.
But the values are the grid cells.
I see.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Okay. Okay, so if you had individual data, you would posit a model. And by the way, this is a model that many ecologists choose if they actually do have individual data. And then how would you fit it? You would fit it by maximum likelihood, right? So you would choose the value of your parameters theta to maximize the probability of the data that you observe given your model parameters theta. Okay. So I want to dive into this. Okay, so this would be straightforward. And I want to sort of make one assumption explicit here. So this is sort of a standard assumption in statistical estimation, is that actually when we did this and we're fitting by maximum likelihood, we'll assume that all these birds are actually behaving independently. And I'm going to illustrate that in my graphical model by this plate to denote independent repetition of the individual model. And I'm going to let this superscript m be an index over all of the birds. Okay, so x superscript m subscript t is the position of the mth bird at time step t. Okay. All right, so before moving on, I want to dive into this in just a little bit more detail because this is a point that's going to be important in a minute. Okay, so let's take a look at this model, and let's take a look at our estimation criteria here. And if we actually write out this probability, p of x given theta, we can write that out, and we get an expression that looks something like this. Okay, so what is this expression going to be? It's going to be, let's ignore the first term for now and just look at the second term. We're going to have a big product, and this product follows from independence assumptions over birds and independence assumptions over transitions at different time steps. And in that product are going to appear the transition probabilities. This p is the probability of flying from cell I to cell j at time t. And that transition probability will be raised to this value nt t plus 1 ij, which is the number of birds that fly from grid cell I to grid cell j at time t. Okay. And this follows from just basic independence assumptions. All right, so what's happening here? There's a really important thing to note that on the right-hand side, there's actually no, I'm writing the probability of all these trajectories x, but there's actually no x's appear on the right-hand side. The right-hand side depends only on these count variables n, and that's because these are the sufficient statistics of this Markov model, these counts. Okay, so we can take those counts. We have a table of counts for each pair of time steps, the transition counts from cell A to cell A at time 1, between time 1 and 2, between time 2 and 3, between times t minus 1 and t. And these are the sufficient statistics of the model. And it actually suffices to maximize our likelihood function, maximize this function f of n theta instead of maximizing p of x theta if we want to sort of fit our parameters theta. Okay, so this is standard sufficient statistics of a model. Okay. All right, so just to wrap up the thought experiment. So the main message here is that if we have individual data, life is good. We choose a model, we fit it by maximum likelihood, we can choose the model that we want, and this is a straightforward computational problem, and to maximize the likelihood, we actually maximize this function here that depends only on the sufficient statistics and not all of the individual outcomes. Okay, but unfortunately we don't have individual data. So we don't have individual data, what should we do? So we're going to follow the same approach. We're going to still write down a model, a generative model for the data that we have. Okay? And so the question is, we don't have individual data. What model should we use? Anyone have any ideas? So, I'll argue that our view of the world hasn't changed just because we have different data. Our view of the world is basically the same as what it was. I'll argue that we should use the exact same model. We have the exact same beliefs about the world as we had before, we just have different data. All right, so let's try modeling it that way. So we're going to have a model for the trajectories of all the individuals of the population. And then what is the eBird data, these sort of spatial distributions at different time steps? These are really, if we know where every bird is at every time step, certainly that determines the spatial distribution at any given time step. So we can think of the eBird data as being aggregate counts, where I can take for each grid cell, like A through Z, I can look at all my individual variables, and I can count up how many birds are in grid cell A at time 1, how many birds are in grid cell B, how many birds are in grid cell Z. Okay? So this clearly is enough information to determine the spatial distribution. Okay, so my eBird data, so this gives me the exact number of birds in every grid cell at every time step. Certainly my eBird data doesn't give me this much information, but I can think of my eBird data as being noisy aggregate counts. So I can think of my actual eBird observations, y. So let's think of this as being a vector, where at any given time step for any grid cell, I get sort of an approximate count yt of z, which is the number of birds that are observed in that grid cell that time step. So something that depends probabilistically on the n vectors. Okay, so as an example, just to fix in your mind, maybe the actual number of birds that are observed is a Poisson random variable with mean equal to some lambda. Let's think of lambda as being a detection probability times the actual number of birds that are present in that grid cell. Okay, question?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I lost it. Why isn't the plate around the n's and the y's?
Okay, so the plate, so here I have a large population of individuals, and based on that population of individuals.
Okay, I'm sorry, I got it.
Okay. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, so here we have, what we have is, we have a generative model for eBird data. Okay, so what is the problem that we want to solve now? It's actually the same problem as before, fundamentally. So we have a model, we have this noisy aggregate data Y. These are eBird counts in different grid cells. And what I want to do still is I want to learn these model parameters. These are the parameters for the individual Markov model for how birds are moving around. And so this is the fundamental problem now. So I want to find the parameters theta to maximize the probability of my data Y given theta. There's a secondary problem which is also very important, which is I also want to perform inference over this hidden variables. And I'm going to leave that deliberately a little bit vague right now. What do I mean by that?
Are you making an assumption that the transition probabilities are the same between every pair of time steps?
No, I'm not. So that's why I'm allowing it to depend on this external parameter theta. So actually, the only assumption that I really want to make right now is the fact that it has this sort of factorization or conditional independent structure, that the transition at any given time step depends only on the current state and not previous ones. But the probabilities can change over time. They do. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. In fact, I'll have an example, I think, in a little while, which I think may help sort of make the specific model more clear. Okay.
And I have this epiphany where I thought I understood it, but I still don't.
Okay.
So n sub 2 is, we're talking about time step 2, and it's a count.
N sub 2 is a vector
Exactly
of
is
counts.
counting?
N sub 1 is a vector of counts for time step 1. And here I'm enumerating all the grid cells, and I'm counting how many birds.
So we could put another plate around there that would be parameterized by grid cells.
Yeah. Yeah. And they're not so like I usually think of plate as being independent replication. These is replication, not so it'd be some sort of relational type. Yep. Okay, and Y is a vector of counts again for all grid cells, but they're noisy counts. Okay, so what I've outlined so far is actually just an observation model. So this is a model for observing aggregate data about a large population. And I guess what I want to highlight is that this is actually I've defined this with respect to this bird migration model, but it's actually a very general model. So for general CGMs, we can follow the same construction, but we can put actually any discrete graphical model inside the plate. So it doesn't need to be this chain-structured model. So we have a large population of individuals sampled from the same graphical model. And then what our observations are, we have noisy observations over contingency tables on small sets of variables. Let me show you actually an example that maybe will make it even more clear. Okay, so this is a pretty good model for data released by, for example, the US Census Bureau. So let's think about the US Census Bureau collects demographic data, and it then publishes reports surrounding things like voting behavior. And so when it publishes a report for voting behavior, usually fundamentally we're trying to think about, can we predict the voting behavior given demographic variables? And also there might be relationships, you might want to choose to model relationships among the demographic variables. So you as a modeler might have this sort of underlying model for voting behavior. What does the Census Bureau release? Actually, if you look at the reports that they release, they're almost always in these forms of contingency tables over one or two variables. So this contingency table over, for example, sex and vote looks like this. What it does is it takes all of the individuals and it categorizes them by all possible values of these two variables, sex and vote, right? And we just get this little 2 by 2 table that says how many individuals are in each possible category, okay? And so this is actually sort of the general observation model that CGMs consider. Okay, one more example. Another example of this construction, so let's think about the same sort of movement model, where instead of birds moving around, we have people moving around. So you all carry these nice little tracking devices in your pocket. And your cell phone provider records at least which tower you're pinging at every given time step. And we may want to, your cell phone provider, or we may want to release that data to actually help understand how humans move around. Okay, so if we were to release data for fitting this model, we would want to release these tables of transition counts. Again, these would be the sufficient statistics for the model. But for privacy reasons, people are hesitant to actually release your individual data. So what can we do? The things we can do are we can aggregate the data, and then we can add noise to the data. And these are sort of the tenets of differential privacy. So what I want to show here is a model where what I have are all my individuals up here. And here I have actually the sufficient statistics of the model. So I can definitely compute those from all the individual data. And now what I'm going to release are actually noisy sufficient statistics instead of, so I'm going to release these tables of counts that show how many people move from location A to location A at a given time step, location A, location to B, but they're going to be corrupted by noise. Okay? So this is, again, sort of the same general principle. Okay, so the goal, so just to summarize, the goal is to fit the model that you want with the data you have. So we have a model for individuals, we have data about the population, and the questions we should start thinking about at this point are, first of all, is this possible statistically? So is there enough information in the aggregate data to actually fit these models? And then the second question, which will be more the focus of this talk, is this possible computationally? Okay, so I'm actually not going to talk about the first one. Yes?
I have a question. You said that, I'm a little confused, you know your ins in your data. Is that knowledge that, some birds move from A to B, or is it just knowledge of the number of birds in A and B? Because it seems like there's a bit of ambiguity. Like you could have a lot of birds moving, but the totals in each one changes very little. So how does your model sort of deal with that ambiguity?
Okay, so let me try to repeat back the question. I know where birds are at a given time step. I don't know how they're moving back and forth. There might be many different explanations for how birds moved between two time steps that give me the same sort of result for where birds are at each of the two time steps. So there's an ambiguity there. And the answer is yes, that is an ambiguity. We're going to apply the tools of probabilistic inference to infer as much as we can about the transitions they actually made given what we observe. Okay? And we're never going to be able to, in this model, we are not observing the sufficient statistics, so we're going to have to perform inference over those sufficient statistics. Does that answer the question?
Well, it would seem to me like the sufficient statistics would be like the actual number of transitions that you have.
The actual
and
number?
It seems like it's not just noise on that, but it's also like something separate, which is I just know the number in each particular location.
So I have less information than the sufficient statistics. Even if there were no noise, I have less information from the sufficient statistics. That is correct. Yeah, okay. Okay, so that doesn't mean, though, that we can't learn the model parameters, and that's an important point. So even it turns out without seeing sufficient statistics, you can still learn model parameters. Okay, so what I want to focus on now is this sort of second question, which is it actually possible computationally? So this is like not that hard of a model to write down, but it actually turns out to be not a very nice model at all for doing inference. All right? And so that's the big crux. So we can write down a very simple statistical question. We want to maximize the likelihood, but can we actually solve that computationally? Okay, and so one of the key ideas in collective graphical models is this was a really simple model. I just said there's a whole bunch of there's like 1 million birds flying around, and they all have trajectories every time step. A key idea behind collective graphical models, which is why they're called collective graphical models, is that I actually, fortunately, don't need to reason separately about each of these individual birds, that I can actually analytically marginalize away the individual birds to get a new model whose hidden variables are no longer the trajectories of each individual bird. Their trajectories are these tables of counts. they're actually the sufficient statistics of the model. So these are the sufficient statistics. These are the hidden variables in the new model. My observed variables are something less than the sufficient statistics, okay? Okay, so what does this mean that I can actually write down a new probability model on this, so here I've drawn a new graphical model, and the variables are these tables of sufficient statistics. What it means is I can actually write down in closed form the probability distribution over these tables, okay? And here's what it looks like, all right? So there's actually two terms. The second term we saw before. The second term is this f of n theta that I showed you before. It's the probability of a large population of birds that have these sufficient statistics. But as you might imagine, there's an ambiguity, because if I know that I have these sort of sufficient statistics, there might be many, many different ways that I could assign trajectories to individual birds that would result in this table of transition counts. And what this first term is doing is actually counting every possible way of doing that, right? So this is why you see things like multinomial coefficients and combinatorial terms in here. So let's, for future reference, just remember that that is called h of n, and this is sort of a combinatorial term. Okay, so I now have a new model on the sufficient statistics, and one of the sort of remarkable things here is that this is a graphical model, and it has the same factorization structure. In fact, it's still a Markov model. In fact, this is true for a broad class for all collective graphical models, that we can derive this new model on sufficient statistics, and it factors according to the same factorization structure as the original model. Okay, so this is something that has been known for a while by statisticians, although not really employed in any sort of inferential way. Okay, so the question is it possible computationally? So let's think about the problem of just computing the likelihood. I now have two identical models for my observed eBird data y. I have one with hidden variables or individuals. I have one where I've marginalized away the individuals. I now have many fewer variables. I have those tables of sufficient statistics. All right, so these are all graphical models. So if I want to compute the probability of y given theta, well, I can do that just by summing the joint probability, summing over all of the hidden variables in each one of these cases. So I can apply standard graphical model inference algorithms. And if I do that in the first model, this actually doesn't go that well, which is not a surprise. I have variables for every individual in the population, and even if I take advantage of the sort of Markov structure, the running time of variable elimination is still exponential in n, the number of individuals. So here, L is the number of grid cells, n is the number of birds. Okay, so here, this is a much more compact model, right? It has many fewer variables. I got rid of that big plate over individuals, so we could hope it would go better. And in fact, if I apply variable elimination in this model, it does go better. And this is what I get. I now have something that is polynomial time in the number of individuals, but unfortunately, I took this L and turned it into an L squared minus 1 and moved it up into the exponent. So it's actually exponential in the number of grid cells. Okay, and let me give you a little bit of intuition why. The reason is because these hidden variables are now these tables of integer counts that add up to n. And I have many fewer variables, but if you think about how many possible tables of integer counts are there that add up to n, well, that turns out to be about n to the L squared minus 1. So I have fewer variables, but now they take on many, many different values. And so if I want to sum over all possible values of them, that's going to take a long time. Okay, so actually, although I will point out, notice if you had a Markov chain on just two states, if L was equal to 2, this actually would be a pretty nice algorithm. This wouldn't be bad. So there is actually something real happening here. But for birds, we have many more than two states. We're thinking about maps with hundreds or thousands of grid cells. Okay. Unfortunately, the good news sort of ends there. So we have these two different algorithms. One is polynomial in L, one is polynomial in N. And we showed in 2013 that there's no algorithm that's polynomial in both of these parameters unless p equals np for exactly computing the likelihood. So we can't hope to actually exactly compute or maximize our likelihood. Okay. So the story so far is actually not so bad. So because we can't do this exactly, we're going to have to do it approximately. And it turns out that there are some very nice approximations we can apply. Yeah? sharp p complete, your intuition is because it's like computing a probability. Yeah, I mean, it's possible. So yeah, like inference, a lot of like marginal inference problems are definitely sharp p hard. Yeah, I mean, we proved that it was NP hard only. We didn't prove that it was sharp p hard, and so I actually don't know if it's sharp p hard, but I agree with the sort of general intuition. Okay, so I want to talk about the progress that we have made. And the progress has been focused on coming up with fast and principled approximate inference algorithms. And in fact, there's some really nice things that you can do, and we're actually not giving up that much. And the way that I want to tell the story, though, is empirically. So let me tell the story by actually showing some results on a synthetic benchmark problem that we built. Okay, so here's a little simple problem. We have a grid cell where over time birds migrate, or we have a grid where over time birds will migrate from the bottom left to the top right of the grid. And the way are they going to choose to make transitions from grid cells is going to be based on this model here, which is something like a logistic regression model, where I have some parameter values, theta k, and I have some features fk that describe the movements between pairs of grid cells at a given time. Okay, and what features do I use? They're very simple features, such as the distance from grid cell I to grid cell j. We also have a little synthetic wind generator, and we have a feature for is this transition with or against the wind, and features for whether I is equal to j, whether the bird should stay put. Is it a self-transition? Then we have a true set of parameters. We generate data from this model, and then we try to recover the parameters using maximum likelihood estimation and collective graphical models. And the way that we do learning is using EM, or expectation maximization, with sort of inference as the key subroutine. So let me sort of go back one slide to explain that a tiny bit more. So here's my model. I want to maximize the likelihood. So what EM is going to do is it's going to guess a value for theta. I'm going to get the data y. And then I'm going to infer the expected value of these hidden sufficient statistics given my parameter theta and my data y. So now I have filled in my sufficient statistics. I can use those to re-estimate theta and then repeat. Okay, so that's what EM is doing. And what I want to highlight there is that really the key subroutine here is this step of inference, or estimating these expected sufficient statistics given parameters and data. Okay, so the story is really about one for performing this inference. Okay, and so what can we do? So when we first introduced this framework sort of formally in a way that allowed statistical estimation in 2011, we introduced a Gibbs sampler for doing this inference. A Gibbs sampler, maybe that sounds very easy. It was a very delicate Gibbs sampler. It required some nice ideas, and I won't go into them now, but one of the things to think about is these tables of sufficient statistics have many, many constraints among them. And in order to sort of obey these constraints within a Gibbs sampler, we need to use this concept of a Markov basis. Okay, so this Gibbs sampler was very nice in one way, is that it scaled very well with respect to the population size. So in fact, we showed both empirically and theoretically that the running time was essentially independent of the number of birds, which is a really nice property, right? Okay, and if we run that on a very small problem, 16 grid cells, we see that we can actually estimate the parameters with very little error as well. Okay, so the problem that we discovered with this Gibbs sampler is that it scaled well with respect to the population size, but not the size of the actual map, the number of grid cells. So if we go to a slightly bigger problem with just 49 grid cells, then after 1,500 seconds or so, we still are actually not anywhere close to the right answer. Okay.
What's the population like?
I think the population is, it could be, I'm actually not entirely sure for this particular experiment. We can basically go anywhere from 1,000 to 1,000,000 to 10 million, and it actually doesn't have much of an effect on these results.
So why is this approximate? I mean, is it that EM is not really working in a convex optimization space, or is it that you have computational issues with getting convergence?
Yeah, so right now it's approximate only because of the MCMC Gibbs sampling. So Gibbs sampling, I'm getting samples that if I can run it forever will give me the true expected value. but it's because I can't run it forever. That's why it's approximate right now. So now I'm getting into real approximations, but actually these are good approximations. So one of the intuitions that you might have is that a key difficulty when doing this inference was the fact that I was dealing with these large tables of integers, right? And that actually was the fundamental problem in terms of the computational complexity. And so you might think, well, if you have a population of 1 million, do you really need to actually reason about exact integer numbers of birds? What if you reasoned about, fractions of the population, or what if you just relax those integers to be continuous variables? And it turns out that if you do that, and I will dive into this a little bit more, time permitting, that you can formulate inference in CGMs as a convex optimization problem. So this is actually really nice. When we discovered this, this actually improved the sort of estimation by quite a lot. Okay, so following that idea, another intuition you might have is that, well, we have a whole lot of individuals, following the same model. One of the things that often happens when you have a whole lot of individuals following the same model is that you get some sort of convergence to a Gaussian distribution. And in fact, that's also true for collective graphical models. And there's actually a really beautiful result that if you take this collective graphical model, those tables of sufficient statistics, that distribution, as the number of individuals goes to infinity, converges in distribution to another graphical model that looks exactly the same, except all of these random variables are Gaussian. Okay, but it's still a graphical model. So this is a Gaussian graphical model that has, again, the same factorization structure. So we can do inference in this model as an approximate inference technique. And I'm not showing the performance of that. And the reason is I can't make a perfectly fair comparison. Basically, that works well, very well, and is very fast in some situations. But in other situations where you would expect a Gaussian approximation not to be good, it's not very good. And those are those cases where there's some sort of hint of determinism in the problem, like there are counts that are close to 0 in some grid cells or something like that. And Gaussians don't tend to do well in those situations. Okay, so what really sort of broke this open for us was digging more into this convex optimization problem. So more recently, we sort of identified some really deep connections between this particular convex optimization problem and those convex optimizations that appear in sort of the theory of variational inference in standard graphical models. Okay, and what this led to was message passing algorithms sort of akin to belief propagation for collective graphical models. And so we were able to develop some very, very fast algorithms. And so in particular, this nonlinear belief propagation is fast and very robust. And then we also developed this proximal algorithm, which is beautiful and incredibly fast. But unfortunately, notice that it doesn't quite converge to 0. And that has actually been a real, even though this has actually been, so this is the main algorithm that we use. This algorithm, so far, we haven't actually been able to make robust enough to do the things statistically that we want to do. I wasn't going to sort of dive into the details here. The main story I wanted to tell here is that belief propagation is this algorithm that is well-defined for trees. And then it's this algorithm for computing the marginals of a graphical model. And this is this algorithm that is defined. It's only sort of a well-defined correct algorithm for trees, but people apply it on loopy models anyway, right? And it sort of seems to work. And this was sort of a mystery for a long time, until in about 2000, Yedidia, Freeman, and Weiss came along and they sort of analyzed, what is this actually doing when it's applied to loopy models? And they found that it's sort of approximately solving this optimization problem, which is this sort of, and the optimization problem it's solving relates to this thing called the sort of beta free energy. Okay, so just to sort of like give the super brief version, what happens in collective graphical models, if you take our probability, the probability of n given y, you take the log of that probability and you apply Stirling's approximation to deal with the log of these factorials that showed up a long time ago, then sort of what pops out somewhat magically is this beta entropy. Okay, and the reason this pops out is because Stirling's approximation to first order is that log of n factorial is approximately equal to n log n. So I have this sort of entropy term show up. And lo and behold, the problem we're trying to solve is like mathematically super, super close to this problem that Yedidia, Freeman, and Weiss identified that BP is also trying to solve, except our problem has a little extra to it. And so that means that we can actually formulate this, what we call nonlinear belief propagation. It's actually a generalization, a strict generalization of belief propagation. Super simple algorithm for doing inference in collective graphical models. I think, okay, and we can show that this algorithm, if it converges to an optimum of our inference problem. Okay, so let me show some results. So finally then, after quite a few years, we've finally been able to turn back to the original problem of fitting these models on actually reasonably sized maps, okay? So this is results that my student actually just came up with, like basically last week. And so what I'm gonna show you is actually things that we've been able to produce visualizations that look like this for a long time. But the key difference of what's going on here is that the model, the underlying model that we're performing inference with respect to, has actually been learned using eBird data, okay? So the setup here is that we have a number of different years of eBird data. We have fit a model, we fit the parameters for a very simple model, essentially the same one from our synthetic problem, using 3 years of eBird data, and we're showing the reconstructed sufficient statistics for a 4th year. And I'm gonna show the movie of how that goes. Okay, and so what's going on is you can see that you can probably see the grid underlying here. The little orange, it's a little bit hard to see, but the sort of orange coloration of the grid cell is proportional to the number of birds that are in that grid cell at a given time step. And the arrows are showing the top 1,000 transitions between all possible pairs of grid cells over the entire year. Okay, so we're getting like what is a reasonably faithful reconstruction using a fitted model of the migration behavior of this species of bird, the ruby-throated hummingbird. Okay, so we have a long way to go in terms of taking this and actually doing science with it. So we need to do things like now we actually have parameter values. We needed to be able to do things like put good confidence intervals on those parameter values. We need to compare them to null models. But I guess the main story that I want to tell is that we have finally, after a lot of work on this problem, developed sort of the basic computational tool for doing this. Okay. I think I can show you a little cartoon of stochastic network design. So the other sort of broad thing that I work on is optimization. And one of the frameworks I've developed is this framework called stochastic network design. And stochastic network design applies to problems of optimizing connectivity in networks. So one particular problem that we've been working on is this problem of creating habitat for fish. So we can think of the movement of fish, such as salmon, which in a river network, as actually diffusion in a network. So we think of salmon swimming from the ocean upstream into rivers and streams to spawn. We can think of that as being a diffusion. What happens to salmon swimming upstream? This is well known in the Northwest. They run into barriers. Those barriers come in the form of dams. And also sort of maybe not as well known, they also come in the form of culverts, these pipes where small streams go underneath roads. Okay, so what we as conservationists would like to be able to do, we would like to be able to go in and remove some of those dams or install passive structures to allow the fish to reach sort of more of their historical spawning habitat. Okay. So what's going on here, of course, we have a limited budget for doing that. So this is ultimately, there's a the conservation problem here is one of resource allocation. So if we have a limited funds, which barriers should we remove to maximize the accessible habitat? Okay, so this is one instance of a much more general class of problems I've been working on, which is if you have a complex network and you have a diffusion process occurring in that network and you can make interventions to sort of facilitate that diffusion, how should you do so? And this has a number of applications in sort of the sustainability and ecology. We've been working on this for making road networks more resilient to natural disasters. This model, same sort of model and problems apply to information propagation in sort of social networks. And there's quite a lot of applications of similar ideas in the field of spatial conservation planning. Okay. So I won't say anything about how I do it except for the fact that it's hard. And it's hard, but there's some really nice things that you can do. Our goal is to develop very fast, principled but approximate algorithms. We can do that. And one of the goals of developing algorithms that are really fast is that we can actually turn around and we can develop tools to take them to conservation planners so that they can actually interactively create conservation plans. And so this is a small website that was built by an undergraduate I work with, taking one of our algorithms, where there's actually a little budget slider down on the bottom. You can slide around the budget, and you can find which set of barriers should we remove to increase connectivity in this river network. And you can see this happen basically in real time. Okay. So just to wrap up. So I sort of talked most of the time about this framework of collective graphical models. This is a framework for learning about models of individuals when only aggregate data is available to you. I talked much more briefly about this framework of stochastic network design, but I hope I gave you at least a flavor. There's sort of many sort of decision-making problems, especially in conservation and other areas, that involve optimizing diffusion processes and networks. And then I just sort of want to make again, the much bigger picture that I think there's a lot of important work in this area of, big data and ecology and conservation. Carla Gomez came and gave a talk not too long ago about computational sustainability. This is part of that bigger umbrella. And basically, I think that there's opportunities both to do important work in the domains and also find really interesting problems to work on in computer science. Okay, so with that, I will thank a small list of students and key collaborators. And if there's any time remaining, I'll take questions. Yes?
So I remember when you were laying out your explicit model for the plate-based model what birds were doing. You made an assumption that the movements of birds were independent of one another, which is maybe not entirely realistic.
Yeah, okay, so this is actually a great question. So I think there's two pretty good answers to it. So first, yes, I did make that assumption. And so the one thing that I'll highlight is that basically this is exactly the same assumption you would make if you had individual data and we're trying to estimate from tags. And it is exactly the same assumption that ecologists do make when they collect individual data, is that the birds are not interacting. And the second thing I'll claim is that for a large class of the birds that we actually study, this is actually a reasonably good assumption. So people often think about things like flocks of geese, which is the number one thing. And this is one case where it's not a great assumption. But for a large class of birds, such as songbirds that migrate at night, they're basically making the decision whether or not to migrate, queuing off of environmental conditions and not queuing off of the behavior of other birds. And so in that case, it does satisfy our assumption.
So you're saying that you can infer individual behavior from aggregate data, and from birds it seems fine, but for people and senses, it seems fishy. So what should we do to prevent you from doing it with human data?
So what I'm inferring are sufficient statistics and parameters. I'm not necessarily inferring the value of your variables.
Right, so some of them are, so presumably we are obfuscating them to, what are the implications? So we're obfuscating the data to prevent people from learning some of it. Maybe some of those parameters that you're inferring, or?
So I can't break anything so if you're worried about privacy, the canonical thing that you would do is you would aggregate and add noise to satisfy this formal definition of differential privacy, and you get very strong theoretical guarantees. And so in fact, the model that I present is a good model for doing inference over everything that you can learn about the sufficient statistics of the population after that noise has been added. But there's no implications here in terms of breaking. I mean, I can't learn anything I can't learn any signal that's not in the data, right? So I think they're somewhat they're somewhat separate questions. If you're worried about privacy, you should take steps to avoid privacy. I think these tools actually give you a framework for learning everything you can about the parameters of a model, given that noise has been added to work for privacy reasons.
One of the original animations, it looked like there's parts of the map that just had no observations. And some of that might have been because birds don't go to the desert, but I'm guessing also that part of there's no observers. So is that built in here as well, that there's possibly you're not observing?
Yeah. So in the observation model, it's entirely okay for some grid cells to not have any observations, and I didn't go into the details. It's also okay for one grid cell to have many, many observations, and that all sort of gets cleanly handled by the observation model.
So I think we have to wrap up here because we ran out of time, but then we'll be around here tomorrow